Harper, do you recognize Sarah Boone at the defense table with Tony Henderson?
I do.
When did you first get involved with Miss Boone?
It would have been in around June of 2020. It was the first I heard of her case.
And what were you asked to do?
A comprehensive psychological evaluation of Ms. Boone.
And did you do that in Miss Boone's case?
I did.
Okay. Were you given materials to review?
I was.
Is that standard operating procedure?
Yes.
You assess the client individually, one-on-one, and then there are collateral evidence or material that you also consider?
Yes.
Can you tell the jury about that?
Yes. So in forensic work, there are a variety of documents that are usually available in assessing a defendant. In this case, for criminal court, you would see things like witness statements. There might be body cam footage or just more information about the offense itself. Sometimes there's an interrogation video. So you would get kind of the legal description of the offense and the things that have occurred. I also will often get educational records of a person, mental health records, hospital records, things of that nature that would describe their biopsychosocial history to me.
And you were given materials as it relates to Sarah Boone to review?
Yes, I have it.
How many times did you meet with Sarah Boone?
So 9 times.
All right. Can you tell the jury what you did as part of your evaluation of Sarah Boone?
Well, we had a clinical forensic interview in which I reviewed her background history, so her early childhood. I also assessed her with assessments, meaning I administered 3 psychological tests to her. I reviewed her prior mental health records, her interrogation video, some prior information about her legal history. So she had been previously arrested. I reviewed that as well. We had an opportunity to review the transcript of her interrogation video. So there were a variety of things that would be considered what I did with her.
Okay. So you considered some medical records?
Yes.
And did you also consider some records from Jorge Torres' records?
I did see his hospital records.
Now, do you consider, in doing an assessment and forming any opinions, an individual like Ms. Boone's upbringing in terms of where they grew up and what their family environment was like?
Yes, that's part of gathering their background history, so biopsychosocial information.
And did you consider Ms. Boone's upbringing in forming any opinions?
I did.
Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yes, so of her history, I found it pertinent that she was raised with...
Conduit 704.
Roach. The objection is sustained.
Would you have considered, as part of her family background, whether or not some of her family members had passed away early in her life?
Objection. Leading Conduit
Sustained.
Do you consider the entire family background and history without going into the details of what she said or what you learned from looking at records? I'm sorry?
Yes.
And did you consider her relationship with her mother as part of her psychological development?
Yes.
Now, do you believe that Sarah Boone does have some narcissistic traits?
I do.
She doesn't qualify or meet the criteria for that diagnosis, does she?
I did not diagnose her with that.
Can you elaborate on or explain how you feel that Sarah Boone does have some narcissistic traits?
Well, in meeting with her as part of the evaluation, the narcissistic traits that I identified would have to do with, as she described, being a straight-A student. She reiterated about her abilities, and I felt that that was evidence that she had low self-esteem, and her coping mechanism was to identify what made her stand out, and that would be consistent with a narcissistic trait.
Now, I know there's been reference in this case to a manual that all psychologists, all psychiatrists refer to. Do you have that manual with you?
I do.
And what is the name of that manual?
It is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the text revision. So it's the DSM-5 text revision.
Now, Dr. Brannon testified earlier today, and there was some evidence relating to when you suffer from narcissism, there's a sense of grandiosity. But is that from this manual and your studies and your experience, where they require excessive admiration and whatnot, that there's a reason for that?
If I'm understanding your question, there's a criterion in narcissistic personality disorder related to that.
What I'm getting to is many times you may have these narcissistic traits, but really you suffer from very low self-esteem.
That's the underpinning of that criterion.
Would you explain that to the viewers?
If I'm allowed to reference the DSM, then I can explain it best.
Just don't read from it. Just
All
if
right.
you need to review, if you need to read a paragraph and then explain it to the jury.
So based on the description in the DSM, if a person's self-esteem is very fragile and they have low self-esteem, they may require more outside admiration or even appear more grandiose in their abilities, because at root they don't feel secure and confident. And so it's what we would call a defense. And so that criterion is actually a way that a person tries to make themselves feel better.
Anything else you want to say about that issue?
Well, you asked me about why I didn't diagnose narcissistic personality disorder. And again, from the DSM,
Are there criteria?
there are criterion for each disorder.
And so when you're assessing someone, they have to meet all those criteria for you to form that opinion that they actually suffer from that disorder?
Well, the first, I guess, issue is, do they have the criterion that are listed? And then the second would be, is there a different mental health disorder that would better explain the criterion that you're seeing? The criterion within the DSM overlap considerably across disorders. And so there are some helpful guidelines within the DSM to remind you of that you may have what's called differential diagnosis. So if you're considering one thing, that you also are directed to look at other things. So that happened in this case, in this instance, that the DSM guided me to also look at other things.
But just for purposes, to make it clear, you did not diagnose her with narcissism. that disorder?
That's correct, because the DSM's description guided me that that would not be an appropriate diagnosis.
Why did you not diagnose Ms. Boone with a personality disorder?
Well, first of all, it has to be a pervasive pattern of distorted relational abilities. So basically, if she is demonstrating in a variety of settings that she has these symptoms. And then secondarily, the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder is listed when you're considering personality disorders. The DSM guides you that if there are personality changes that are associated with the exposure to a trauma, then you should consider post-traumatic stress disorder and not a personality disorder.
Have you diagnosed her with anything? And we'll elaborate on that, but through your assessment, have you diagnosed her with anything?
Yes, so she has a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. She has symptoms of anxiety that would be consistent with post-traumatic stress disorder. So that is an anxiety disorder.
And you feel like she suffers from post-traumatic stress?
I do.
Now, at the time of this incident, this event, we're talking February 23rd of 2020, you were aware that she did not have much family support?
Yes.
Doctor, why do you administer psychological testing?
Psychological testing allows an objective measurement of what the person's symptoms may be as compared to sort of an average. So if we can see what the average range on a standardized measure would be for any person, if there is an interpretable difference, that gives me clinical information. So it's not just relying on what the person has told me. I've got an objective measurement that I can compare to other people. And then I also administer psychological testing in a forensic evaluation to help assist me in making sure that the person is intending to put in good effort with me. In some forensic settings, a person may have a reason to present symptoms, like if they're in a custody evaluation, for instance, they might have a reason to minimize symptoms, or they may exaggerate something else. And so assessments as to the person's response to you and if they're validly participating are important.
So there are tests to see if you're faking or malingering or that type of thing?
Right, and so you would call it feigning mental health symptoms when the person is either far exaggerating a symptom they do have, or if they're pretending to have a symptom that they do not actually have.
Now, as it relates to Sarah Boone, what type of psychological testing did you administer?
I administered the inventory of legal knowledge, and that is a test that has to do with whether or not she was validly participating regarding her understanding of the legal process. I also administered the Miller Forensic Assessment of Symptoms test.
Now, explain to the jury what that Miller Forensic Assessment of Symptoms test is.
So that is also a test of feigning to identify if she's validly participating in the evaluation. So if she had endorsed psychological symptoms or psychiatric symptoms that would be unusual or not typical of a valid psychiatric patient.
What were the results of Ms. Boone's test on the Miller Forensic?
She validly participated. There was no indication of any feigning or malingering.
And as far as the inventory of legal knowledge case, what were the results?
Again, she was validly participating, and she did not even come close to the cutoff that would put her in the range of feigning.
Can you tell the jury what the purpose of the clinician-administered post-traumatic stress disorder scale is?
Yes. So that would be considered a very useful assessment of post-traumatic stress disorder. It allows me to interview a person about exposure to a traumatic incident and then identify if there's a change in behavior that has occurred as a result of that exposure to trauma.
At the time that you administered that test, did Ms. Boone in fact have post-traumatic stress disorder?
Well,
Or tell me the results. Just
yes.
explain.
So the results would be consistent with a person having post-traumatic stress disorder. I do not diagnose from one test. That wouldn't be appropriate, but it is consistent with the background and the symptoms that I had previously, taken down during my evaluation of her. So the clinical portion, when we go through symptoms, that was consistent with the outcome of that test.
And would this testing, all the testing, help you determine if Ms. Boone had a change in functioning from before the alleged trauma
Bless you.
to after the alleged trauma? And I'm referring to the trauma. We're going to talk about what the trauma was, but the trauma was the intimate partner violence?
That's correct.
Okay. But would that testing help to determine if she had a change in functioning from that trauma of the intimate partner violence?
Absolutely.
And did you determine that she did suffer from trauma as a result of intimate partner violence?
That was my conclusion. Yes, that's my opinion.
Now, in considering all the available information, you don't just rely on what Ms. Boone tells you to
No.
make your decisions.
No, I don't. I do interview a person as part of the clinical forensic interview, of course, but I also consider things that are reported, like in the arrest narrative, witness statements, all of the medical records. So there are a variety of sources of information, collecting data points and reviewing those to arrive at a conclusion.
So you did review Ms. Boone's previous diagnoses in her history?
Yes,
Did you consider the previous diagnoses in arriving at your own?
I did. Yes.
What did Ms. Boone, what had she been diagnosed with prior to you getting involved?
Objection, 704, conduit.
Roach. The objection is sustained.
But you would agree, and I think this is a fair question, you would consider prior other experts who may have diagnosed her with something?
So I would definitely consider her mental health records, diagnoses previous clinicians may have arrived at the time
Okay.
when I diagnosed her myself.
Okay, and given the assessment that you did with Sarah Boone, and considering the totality and the time you spent with her and the other records, did you diagnose Sarah Boone with anything?
Yes, so post-traumatic stress disorder, it's my opinion at the time of the offense she had depression and she had an alcohol use disorder.
All right. I know we've talked about post-traumatic stress disorder. I don't know if I need to ask you anything further. I think the jury probably understands that. Is there anything else you wanted to add about that disorder?
I'm not sure what the jury's already been told about post-traumatic stress disorder, but in Sarah Boone's case specifically, because of enduring, she specifically noted the time that she was stabbed with the knife as being an extremely...
Sustained.
You have viewed some exhibits involving her being stabbed?
I think that we have had exhibits in common. I'm not sure what was admitted.
Have you seen the physical scar from Sarah Boone being stabbed in the back of the leg?
Yes, I've seen her scar.
Overruled.
Just generally, without getting specific, I think I've explained post-traumatic stress, but if there's something else you believe the jury needs to know, but it's a sort of trauma that occurs as a result of one or more events?
Post-traumatic stress disorder is the psychological after effect of being exposed to a very significant stressor or cumulative stressors that make the person's behavior, thinking, and mood change. And so the change can include things like the person becomes hypervigilant, is easily startled, has trouble thinking, has trouble sleeping, so their body is in a state of agitation. It can also include changes in mood that would include irritability, difficulty relating to others, and that they might be resistant to trust easily. So those are all
They have
features.
trouble sleeping sometimes.
Yes.
Sleep deprivation is a real issue.
It's associated with things like nightmares and having trouble settling.
Now, you mentioned that you had diagnosed her with depression. Can you just give us a general understanding for the jury of depression?
So the persistent sad mood, including feelings of hopelessness, helplessness, having difficulty concentrating, sleep problems, changes in appetite, those would be typical of depression.
And Sarah Boone suffered from that?
Near the time of the offense, yes.
All right, can you explain to the jury alcohol use disorder? That's a fairly new name. That's 5 or 6 years ago. The manual came up with a different name.
It did, right. And so that would be, in layman's terms, you might call that alcoholism. It's a tendency to drink too much and then have some kind of consequence in your life as a result of your substance use.
And alcoholism can be depending on how much you drink and then how often you drink.
That's right.
All that is something that you would consider in diagnosing.
Yes.
The many people who suffer from alcohol use disorder, I don't know how to put this, are they in denial?
I would say that is one of the stages of alcohol use disorder and amenability to treatment. So in denial, it's because you do not want to acknowledge that there are consequences from your use, because in doing that, you might have to reduce how much you're using. So to deny means that you feel that you can continue your use without having to change that. So you want to maintain the access to the substance.
You don't have a problem.
That's right.
What is the difference between traits and a diagnosis?
Well, we all have personalities, and so you're going to have coping mechanisms that include personality styles. So, for instance, even though you might not be diagnosable as something, there are times when if you're upset, hurt, frustrated, you have a mood state that's unpleasant, you're going to deal with that by using some kind of coping mechanism. So traits of personality disorders might be present in the way that you deal with inner pain, things that you don't like, feeling. So some people, for instance, if they feel uncomfortable, they may cling too much or become excessively bonded to try to escape a feeling that they don't like, and that might be a dependent personality trait. It doesn't necessarily mean that they have a personality disorder, because that would have to be pervasive across all the environments. But when stressed or upset or not feeling good, you're going to use some kind of coping mechanism, and that might be one of the criterion, for instance, of the personality disorder. You would call that a trait.
And is it your understanding that this trauma that one suffers from repeat domestic violence can cause one to be considered suffering from the syndrome, we call it battered spouse or battered woman syndrome?
Yes, so the diagnosable condition would be PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder. That's how a clinician would label the response to trauma. The pattern between partners, the person's coping mechanism because of that trauma, that would be what's considered battered spouse or battered partner syndrome.
And you're aware that concept of being traumatized by the battered spouse syndrome or the post-traumatic stress is relevant to a self-defense case?
Yes.
In a criminal context.
Yes, I understand that.
Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, under the battered spouse syndrome, the person would experience a trauma or a situation in which they feared harm. And based on that fear of harm, they would react in a certain way that might not be understandable to other people. So their fear is based on the pattern of behavior between them and their partner. That might not be the case for another set of people.
Now, I know that Dr. Lenore Walker is the one who first uncovered this syndrome back in the 70s.
Her research study generated the term. She was interested in why battered women specifically at first, that was what was studied, didn't leave their partner because, of course, they're experiencing traumatic events, risks to their life, but then they didn't leave. So she undertook the original research study on that.
Just briefly touch on, because I know Dr. Brandon has this, there was a 3 stages that Dr. Walker developed for that syndrome.
I think you're referring to phases that a person may go through or the cycle of the relationship. That includes the tension building phase in which there is the first instance that tension is building within the partner. There might be a change in tone, a signaling that there's a difference in agitation. The second is the true battering event, so something has happened between the partners that's violent in nature. And then third, there's the honeymoon phase, which is to keep the relationship intact. The batterer would engage in what's like called honeymoon behaviors, like trying to repair the relationship, apologize, essentially keep the victim from departing from the relationship. So those are 3 phases.
And is it fair to say that psychologically the abuser, does alcohol often involved in the abuse?
Yes.
And as far as the victim that's getting abused, and you say it's a cycle, is the victim, when they go through that last stage, the honeymoon stage, are they thinking, okay, it's going to be better?
Yes, the hopefulness in that, trying to believe that the behavior has changed, that they're not going to be abused again, the hopefulness to maintain the relationship, to forgive. That's part of that last stage, phase 3, is maintaining the relationship.
I don't think I've asked this. Why would someone who has been exposed to intimate partner violence perceive the likelihood of a new violent event about to appear? Why would they perceive the likelihood of that violence differently than, say, a normal person?
Well, it speaks to the pattern. So any relationship will have its own special pattern, that you have things that only your partner knows about you, or certain looks that you give that mean something, and you learn that over time. So over a period of incidents, basically, the victim begins to perceive cues that would signal impending danger. Those cues could be really subtle, just a change in tone, or some small behavior that might not mean much to another person, but it has preceded other violent acts. So, for instance, if your husband decides that he is not going out that night, he might put on different clothes to stay home, and that could be a signal, like abuse and violence has occurred in his stay-at-home clothes. For instance, that might not mean much to another person because, again, it's specific to that dyad. Those 2 people know those patterns. So the victim may perceive a small or subtle change in their partner as a cue because they've become hypervigilant. The body knows when it's experienced a threat to itself, and it will take note. We record memories differently when we're at risk. So these subtle cues become very well memorized by somebody who's being victimized.
Now, on this, and battered spouse syndrome is a subset of post-traumatic stress disorder, which you've diagnosed Sarah Boone with. When those personality changes occur and they persist after an individual has been exposed to this extreme stress, is that when the diagnosis occurs?
The changes would be as a result of the pattern. The person experiences a change like in their sleeping, in their hypervigilance. That's when you can diagnose it. So you can have a trauma or an experience of a scary incident, but it doesn't mean that you will absolutely have post-traumatic stress disorder. You have to have those reactive symptoms that would suggest that it's present.
In your opinion, and I know you've gone over this event with Sarah Boone, this February 23rd, 2020 event, is your opinion that she was suffering from battered spouse syndrome at the time of that event?
Yes, she had the patterns ingrained in her behavior that would be typical of a victim who's responding to traumatic events in a predictable way. So that would fit that.
And it's fair to say that because of the intimate partner and the prior violence, that you would have a heightened sense of when danger was about to occur.
Yes.
When a threat was about to occur.
Yes.
A threat of danger.
That's right.
Now I want to talk about placating the abuser. A victim placating an abuser. Are there predictive cues which an abuser may exhibit to a victim that result in a high level of anxiety arousal, in which the battered woman may attempt to reduce through several different means to delay the beating? Can you explain that?
Yes. So the phase of the relationship that starts with that tension building, that is a jumping off point potentially. So if you can stop the escalation, you might stay in phase one for a period of time. Phase one being that tension building phase and trying to reduce it and not allow it to escalate. So placating the abuser might include distraction. It could include substance use. It could include a change of scenery. There are a lot of things that a partner will learn to do so that they don't have the escalation into an abusive event, if possible. It doesn't always stop it.
Now, in reviewing all of the data, all the reports, medical records, and whatever reports you considered, videotape that you may have watched, as it relates specifically to Sarah Boone, are her words her power?
Her words, I would say, are the weapon that she has.
Explain that to the jury.
In reviewing the available videos that I had to review, you would see that when Ms. Boone is very stressed, when she's experiencing a high level of anxiety, she becomes short in her tone. You can hear that in her voice. There's a strain. Sharper words come out. I think that that is the way that she would try to respond to Mr. Torres. You can hear that sharpness in her voice when she's very stressed out.
Now, would you agree that victims may exhibit a range of behaviors when they're suffering from intimate partner violence?
Yes.
Self-isolation?
Yes.
Suicidal thoughts?
Yes.
Substance abuse?
Yes.
And there are often physical signs of injury such as bruising,
That's correct.
chronic fatigue,
Yes.
learned helplessness.
Yes.
Can you tell I know Dr. Brandon spoke on it, but could you tell us a little bit about that?
So learned helplessness is when you start to form the opinion that nothing's going to make any difference. It comes originally from an animal study in which dogs were shocked, and the research study indicated that even when dogs were given an opportunity to escape the environment in which they were being shocked, if they were shocked enough, they just stopped trying to escape. So even though they had an opportunity to do so, they did not do that. That's called learned helplessness. It's the idea or belief that what your actions are going to do are not going to make a difference, so don't try.
What are intrusive memories?
Intrusive memories are an element of post-traumatic stress disorder in which you don't want to be thinking of a traumatic event, but it intrudes on something else you're trying to do. Like maybe you're folding socks or something like that, just doing something mindless, and that's what takes over your thought process. It's not something that you're trying to think about. We could plan what we're thinking about, or sometimes if you're just having this intrusive experience, that's not what you were intending to think about at all.
Is that one of the conditions that someone may suffer when they have this syndrome of battered spouse?
Yes.
I know there can be triggers that bring on these memories. Am I correct?
That's correct.
Are there also symptoms of this syndrome where, like in the alcoholism, where you have denial that you're in the middle of this cycle?
Well, as part of the relationship, there's an element of pleasure. Like you have early on in the relationship something that binds you together. So you're remembering that, you're hoping for that, even though the repeated cycle is going through the phases 1, 2, and 3, you keep hoping for elements of that honeymoon phase, wishing that it was better. So it is like denial. You're imagining the way it used to be. You have a recollection of that person showing you positive behaviors, and you're hoping for that. I also think it is typical for victims to not reveal to other people that the abuse is going on, and it seems like denial. In other words, your coworkers ask you, like, are you okay? Did something happen to you? You're not likely to disclose that. That looks a lot like denial. It is a denial in public of some of the private issues that you're having in your relationship, and that's because it's embarrassing. It's revealing a loss of control to other people. It's revealing that things aren't perfect. You might even get feedback that you should leave your partner, and that's unwanted because you're already having that, concern in your own mind about it. And so, it seems like denial on the outside to hide it.
Would you agree many people who suffer from this, they're minimizing what is happening to them?
Yes.
And they're numbing their emotions to it.
Well, to stay present and keep that relationship, it's very difficult for a lot of people because they're experiencing physical and emotional harm. So they want to numb it because numbing it means that you can keep that relatedness no matter how bad it's getting.
Do some people with this syndrome disassociate?
Objection. Relevance.
Do you agree that battered women often develop the defense mechanism of being able to psychologically detach from their body during a traumatic experience?
Some people do experience that.